Welcome to the Regenerative Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Bri Warner, who is the CEO at Atlantic Sea Farms. Atlantic Sea Farms is supporting regenerative agriculture with its various regenerative seaweed products grown using regenerative aquaculture practices. In this episode, we learn about the deep fisherman livelihood and economic development vision driving the company. We get educated on what makes growing seagrass regenerative, and we discuss with Bri how we can scale vertically integrated, regenerative, and women-run businesses like Atlantic Sea Farms and others. Bri is an absolute powerhouse of a human. She dropped so much knowledge on us that it resulted in our longest episode ever, but it is well worth your time, and it was fascinating and inspiring to get to know her, the brand, and their big plans for the future. Let's dive in. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Very excited today to have our first ocean-based brand, and we have Bri Warner from Atlantic Sea Farms with us. So welcome, Bri.
So psyched to be here, guys. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. For anybody who's listened to episode 0, they know that I was a dive master in a previous life. I grew up in Southern California near the ocean. The ocean is near and dear to my heart. So I am incredibly stoked to have our first regenerative aquaculture brand on the pod, so we can kind of share that story and the power of kelp with our audience. So super, super excited. But before we dive into all the cool stuff and all the origin story and like that, Bri, for those who are unfamiliar with Atlantic Sea Farms, give us a quick rundown. What products do you produce? Where can people find you today?
So you can find Atlantic Sea Farms products in retail locations across the country, particularly your natural and organic grocery stores like Whole Foods, Sprouts, Mom's, Wegmans, Fresh Market, Fresh Time, kind of anywhere where you can find natural groceries. And we produce several different products. You can head over to where you buy your kimchis or sauerkrauts for our fermented seaweed salad, which is an analog to that bright green seaweed salad that has all sorts of stuff that you don't want to know what's in it, that you get at sushi restaurants. Ours is a traditionally barrel fermented fresh seaweed that's delicious. As well as a seaweed-based kimchi, the first of its kind, as far as I know. I just got back from Korea and I saw no seaweed kimchis, which I was shocked at. And then you can go to your freezer section, where if you check out your veggie burgers, we just launched a sea veggie burger, which you guys got to have a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and it was phenomenal. Delicious. It was probably one of the best veggie burgers I've ever had in my life. No joke.
Thanks. All the products were really good. Really good.
Thank you. Well, people talk about our sea veggie burger as the kind of product that tastes a whole lot like the veggie burgers of old that actually tasted like vegetables.
Yeah, the ones that were made of food instead of seed oil.
Exactly. It's all full ingredients. And then you can head over to your smoothie section as well, where we have blueberry kelp cubes and cranberry kelp cubes for your everyday smoothie.
We're going to talk about some of this a little bit later, but the challenges of marketing a brand in various aisles. But before we get there, I want, I do and I don't want to ask you this question because I love the seaweed salad at sushi restaurants, and you just sort of like killed it potentially. So what is in those that we don't want to know about?
So all the same thing that's in Peeps, for example, that blue 5 and yellow 1, and, all that stuff. Like, seaweed is not that color. Come on, if you were in the ocean diving, Kyle, and you saw something that was that color, wouldn't you be terrified?
Well, I mean, I've seen some vibrant, bright green sea grasses before, but it's a good point. Like, to see it on your plate, who knows how many days, years, months later. Okay.
Yep, it's lots of dyes. It's also imported dried and then rehydrated. And because it's rehydrated, it's like, it's exactly. And then a bunch of colors are added to it. And there's also some other things that people demonize that they shouldn't, like MSG, which is actually really delicious. We don't use it. But that's been bastardized for a number of years for perceptions. But there's also a lot of other preservatives in there that make, if you can keep seaweed salad in your refrigerator without any fermentation or pickling for 4 months, there's something wrong with the food. There's something that's not natural in there. So our seaweed salad is fresh. It's blanched, shredded, immediately barrel fermented with no accelerators. We do it in
Mm.
literal barrels. We mix everything
Wow.
by hand,
Let's
and then
go.
it gets fermented, and it's got all those healthy probiotics, but also has that delicious kind of natural crunch and a little bit of a green color because when we blanch it, it turns it green. So no dyes, no preservatives, just really good natural food.
Well, I'm really glad that, we killed the sushi seaweed salad, but you gave us an alternative at the same time. So it's not like it's completely removed from our lives. So that I
That's right.
appreciate that kind of like 1-2 combo.
Man.
I mean, it's delicious to get this stuff out there and be able to show people that, right now there's three ways that people eat seaweed in the United States. It's dried into, dashis and things, which is a delicious way to eat seaweed. Seaweed snacks,
Mm.
and or bright green seaweed salad. And then
Mm.
there's of course nori wraps for sushi, but that's a different variety. But that's how people think that you could eat seaweed. That's three ways. There are thousands of others. And so
Mm.
when you say where can you find us, you can also find us. Our products are in Thorne Nutraceuticals green drinks. They're in
Mm.
Navita's.
I drink
Navita's.
that. I
It's
take the
so
Thorn
good.
every day.
There you
Let's
go. So
go.
you're getting kelp in there. Same with like Navita's just came out with a super green, super, like a sea
Love
greens
that.
blend. Mind Blown Seafood Company, plant-based seafood company with their
Mm.
Blind Blow brand is using it in their plant-based scallops, their plant-based crab cakes. You can
Wow.
even get it in plastic bags and plastic straws with Lollyware and Sway, who are using it as a
Wow.
component into their bioplastics. So I just named sort of our place that people see us, but there's so many ways
Hmm.
that our seaweed is being used beyond just sort of the everyday
Yeah.
use.
Love that. And I mean, it's so excited to dive more just into the utility and also kind of like how seaweed is grown and why it's regenerative and all those things, which, but I want to start back because the story of the brand is a very personal story, really, with your path, Bri. And we got a little background on you before the episode, and I'm like, is this woman running for president, or is she running like an ocean-based CPG brand? Like, this one's been a diplomat, she's the kelp queen, she's got it going on. So just take us through like your personal journey and how Atlantic Sea Farms came to be.
That's really nice of you to say. I think I am good in my lane of trying to produce regenerative food, but really, what we are trying to create a movement way beyond just sort of a food product, and I think that is something
Mm.
that's really different about us. Is that what we're doing? If we do it right, we've proven something that others haven't. And it's not
Mm.
about kelp. It's kelp is part of the solution, but really, what we're trying to prove is that climate change adaptation and mitigation can come by relying on the people that
Mm.
already are working. I think so. Let me rephrase that. So much in climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy, we think about throwing robots at it. We think about
Mm.
these big tech solutions, these big ideas that
Mm-hmm.
millionaires and billionaires throw money at to talk about how they are solving global climate change by growing giant wind towers and planting giant kelp farms, or
Mm-hmm.
the ideas are so unachievable.
Mm.
And I think often we approach climate change and food as if we either can't do anything because we're
Mm.
not billionaires,
Mm.
Mm.
or we have to always look to these kind of moonshot solutions
Right.
for answers to something that we actually have the answer to right in our backyard. And it's not just
Mm-hmm.
us, it's also just looking to the people who are really talented and skilled all over the United States and elsewhere. But I'll just speak for us in the US. Like, our biggest richness in the US is our people. It's not
Mm.
our land, it's not our technology, it's us. And
Mm-hmm.
we so often overlook that. And my background, I'm from Pennsylvania, I'm from coal country.
Mm.
I've seen the end of natural resources really hit communities hard, and I've seen people put
Mm.
their head in the sand and pretend like it wasn't happening, even though the writing
Mm.
had been on the wall for ages. And I came from an area where
Yeah.
there's no hope, honestly.
Mm.
And we're 30, 40 years out now from there being viable natural resource based industries, and people are still waiting for the white whale to come in.
Mm.
And I, was a diplomat for a number of years. I worked in economic development, and I came to Maine about 10 years ago. And what was really exciting to me about Maine, there's a lot of things that are exciting to me about Maine. I feel like if I should have any job, it should be like carrying the banner of like Maine.
The state of Maine, the Maine
state of
champion.
Maine. Yeah. Because I just have so many good things to say about it not being of the place. But not only is it beautiful, not only do we have these amazing resources and all the reasons that people want to go to Maine, but what we also has is if you look out on the coast, we have this rocky, gorgeous, clean, nutrient dense coastline. We also have 4,000 plus lobster license holders that are making their income on the water, and they're doing it successfully. 10 of the best years in lobster have been in the last 20. They're reinvesting in conservation ethics into their own industry that is making that industry boom. So
Hell
we're
yeah.
seeing more lobsters in the
That's
past
awesome.
10 years than we have before. There's a darker side to that, which is because of the world around us, nothing to do with the lobster industry itself. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 98% of oceans in the world.
Wow.
And
Wow.
no matter what we do to conserve this industry, lobster larvae will no longer survive at the rate that they are now at some point in the future. And so that setting that up, like economic development, like we could stick our head in the sand or the water, however you want to look at it, and pretend like this kind of like that we did everything right, which we did in this industry. We've really invested in our people. We have 4,000 plus lobster license holders that are individual owner operators. There's no big fleets. If you are fishing on your boat, you must be the license holder.
Wow.
There's no sort of like big men dominating the industry. There are these 4,000 individual business owners that are keeping working waterfront moving in Maine. That, you go to Oregon or California and it's yachts. You go to Maine, it's lobster boats. We definitely have our share of yachts, which we'd like to not see increase. But we have a lot of working waterfront. We have more than most other states. And so, like, how do we keep that? And how do we take the amazing human capital that we have on our coast and have them look at themselves and say, okay, what can we do to diversify? Because we want lobster to always be there. It will likely always be there in some way or another, but it's going to be changing, and we're overly reliant on one species. And that is dangerous for whether there's climate change or not. That's dangerous. It leaves us very vulnerable. So how can we be looking at our incredible human capacity and our incredible natural capacity of more coastline than the state of California, and think about how we can diversify in the face of climate change and adapt?
Wow. All right, you just threw a lot of stats. You just threw a lot of stats at me that I wasn't aware of. That coastline, more coastline than the state of California. That's crazy. I didn't know that. And I want to circle back to something you started with, which is like, we're spending billions of dollars on direct air capture. And it's like, direct air capture has been around for billions of years, bro. It's called photosynthesis. Okay. Like it already exists. All right. And it doesn't cost any money, actually. It's the funny thing about it. But that's incredible. So, how did you get involved in, solving those problems for the lobster industry that led to this? Like, what was the next step to you seeing all that and then turning into this?
I want to go one step before that. Before we went into like solving those problems, like, why did you want to solve those problems? Why was that important to you?
Yeah, and I think on the coastline of California, because I can see Kyle's California being like, what the hell?
I'm looking at a map. I'm not kidding you right now.
This makes sense.
Okay. I can see his head tilting. So it's because we have all these inlets and islands that give us more coast. Yep.
Whoa.
But I saw looking at the map.
It must be those like cookie cutter inlets that go sideways all the time.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. I love that. I saw it. I see Californians go through this every time. Like, no, but we're the biggest.
When you look at a map, like your brain doesn't make sense of that. But if it's a detailed enough map, which mine probably isn't, anyways, off topic.
But I will say who really trumps us both is Alaska. Alaska has more coastline than I think California and Maine combined. So that they got us on that. But when I came back from Maine and I saw how we kind of always wait, and I felt a little bit helpless as a diplomat, just being like, God, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. We're always waiting. We're always reactive. We're never sort of proactively getting out in front of things. And when I came to Maine, I fell in love with the place immediately. My husband's a Mainer, and so I had been a lot, and that's why we came here. But the place is the kind of place that we all want to raise our kids in because of
Mm.
trees. But like people don't lock. One time I was out on an island, I think for an illustrative point, I was out on an island and it was pouring, so I couldn't walk where I was going. So I called one of the islanders and said, like, "Hey, can you come pick me up?" And she said, "I'm not on the island, but you can use my car." And I was like, "Well, how do I get your keys?" She's like, "They're in the car." I'm like,
Duh.
"Your keys are in the car." Like, what? She was like, "Well, yeah. What if someone needs it?" And like, I think
Wow.
Oh
like
man,
that
that's
is
awesome.
sort of like the communities that we live in,
Yeah.
and it's one of those last places in the United States where you feel like it's the kind of place you want to replicate. It's the kind of place you want to be. Your neighbors check on you. It's a community that supports each other. It's a
Mm.
place where like niceness prevails. It's and
Mm.
I think and nature is everywhere and food is everywhere and people invest in beautiful things. And I think it was Anthony Bourdain who said Maine people invest in beautiful food and beautiful and simple, beautiful things that make their everyday. Like it's just a place where
Mm.
people value small things and
Mm.
so for me, it felt like this place that you want to be part of, you want to be part of the fabric. And I had gotten a job as an economic development director for an organization that was really focused on making sure that island and coastal communities in Maine were preserved into the future and allowing people to
Mm.
kind of be who they've always been, because it is a place that everyone wants to be. There's a
Mm.
lot of downward pressure from people who want second homes on the coast of Maine, people who want to come up and
Mm.
see the coast for 2 months, as 2 weeks as their playground, and then go back down to their house in Boston or Philadelphia or New York or
Right.
whatever. And they kind of take it as this token of a place, not as a place where real people, where we all kind of see this way of life as being something that's part of our everyday. And so there's a lot of downward pressure on housing. There's a lot of gentrification of the coast that's taking up working a really important and irreplaceable working waterfront. There's
Mm.
there's a lot of those conversations going on. So working for the organization that was looking at saying, like, how can we keep year-round coastal communities as these schools go from 60
Mm.
kids to 30 kids to 20 kids?
Yeah.
Like, at what point do we lose these year-round communities that mean everything to who we are? And the way that we do that is making sure they're year-round viable, rewarding income.
Mm.
And
Mm.
lobster right now is keeping these communities thriving. And
Hmm.
um, we are all equally concerned, including those within the lobster industry, about how long that will last at the level that it currently is. So I
Mm.
started working with fishermen along the coast and saying, like, okay, guys, what can we do to diversify? And it became very clear to me that oysters, mussels, seaweed, and scallop aquaculture were a way to both give back to the environment, make the environment better, provide people with nutrient dense regenerative foods, and help people adapt to climate change by leaning into the skills that they're really good at and the skills
Mm.
that they have to continue to be in these heritage industries and be who they are. You can't take a fisherman and put them behind a hotel. So number one,
Mm.
because that would
Right.
kill the tourism industry. But number two, because like that's not what they want to be doing.
Right.
Um,
Nobody would come to Maine.
Nobody
Yeah.
would come to me. They'd be like, "Oh my gosh, that was a terrible experience." But also, that's not what they're good at, and it's not, and that's what we often do. Like, why can't coal miners make solar panels? Well, because that's the
Mm.
skill set. And
Mm.
so with seaweed in particular, it's a perfect off-season income. It's complementary to lobster. It uses the same equipment that people use to lobster. Same, general staffing, like a sternman, same kind of territory of water, off season. But there was no buyer in the country and no one making seaweed into
Mm.
products. So that was 2018, and the entire country grew 30,000 pounds of seaweed at that time. But millions
Wow.
that's it.
Nothing.
30,000 pounds total. And we were importing tens of millions of pounds for
Wow.
snacks, sushi.
Opportunity.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And
Mm.
so it felt to me like it was a great opportunity. So I raised some funding and we started a fund basically with this coastal organization to invest in the first commercial seaweed farm in the country. The company was named Ocean Approved, and say,
Mm.
okay, let's expand your supply chain to include fishermen. And after about a year, there was a founder transition, and I was asked to take over as CEO. and that was 2019. And here we are in 2023. And this year we worked with 27 partner farmers. We're just starting our new harvest season as of this week, and we plan to process around 1.3 million pounds of kelp.
Wow. Let's go.
Yeah,
Let's go.
That's crazy. My mind can't do the math because the numbers are too different, like 30,000 pounds to 1.3. Like, what's the growth factor there?
It's a lot. Like, it's
big.
too many times, lots of times.
Yeah,
And
my
we're
brain
still
can't
just
do that
a
math that
speck.
fast.
Yeah, we always are like, we're the vast majority of seaweed grown in the United States, line-grown seaweed in the United States, but we're still 0.001% of all the line-grown seaweed grown in the world. So we have a lot of growing to do, and we have a lot of opportunity. And I think, what we really do is we produce the seeds. So we're super vertically integrated. We produce the seeds. Back to like, why did I do this? The answer is, how do I make it look like lobster to get fishermen to come in? We need to provide the bait. The bait is the seed. So we produce all of the seed in-house. There's also no one else I could buy it from. So I can't be
Hold
let
on.
me just go to that.
How do you produce kelp seed?
Yeah.
Well, there's what we're doing now and what we want to do in the future. And what we're doing now is basically putting on a snorkel and going to the beds that we know are really, really healthy in the fall, so around August, and literally diving on those beds, picking up the best mom and dads that we think would be great parent material for our line grown seaweed, and we harvest around 10 pounds for every 400,000 pounds we grow. So we're really not touching the beds. It's like no disintegration of the beds at all.
Can I come volunteer to help do this? Like, this sounds like such a great day. I would love to come help.
Honestly, Kyle, this year my staff didn't bring me along, and like we're like very, very clear that they didn't need my help anymore, which I was like, what? Like, I've been doing this for 4 years, but apparently I'm not needed anymore. So it is a fun day.
Those beds, Bri, are natural beds, and then you're using the seed for the line grown. Is that correct?
Yep. So kelp starts to feel real sexy around August and starts producing kind of seed to start reproducing. And so we go and look for kind of the healthiest seed, the largest
some
kelp.
Sexy ass kelp.
Some sexy kelp. Like, you're down there and you're like pointing at your colleague, like, look at this one. This one looks ready. And then you bring it in, and if you were letting the seaweed just sort of let go of its seed tissue throughout the year, in the water, it would slowly release. What we do is we make it feel like it just got washed up on the beach, and it's like, okay, I'm going to wait for the tide to come in, and then I'm going to release everything. So it's a very natural process. We just put it in a dark cooler. And then the next day we bring it out. What we do is they call it sporing it off. We basically let the spores release into natural seawater that we just grab from the ocean. And then the little kind of sporelings look for something to attach to. So they swim around, and we give it 2 PVC pipes with twine wrapped around it, and it looks to kind of attach to twine. It grabs onto that twine and holds on, and that's where it will grow for the next 6 months. So we keep it in our nursery for about 45 days, no inputs, just fresh seawater, 12 hours daylight, 12 hours night. And then we give it to our partner farmers, about 45 days later, and it's a PVC pipe with kind of like brown, it almost looks like I don't know, it almost looks like hair almost. You like throw it out on a tube. You give it to farmers. We give our seed for free to our farmers. They tie it to the end of a mooring line, and then they unravel that at 1,000 feet horizontally, attached it to the other mooring, and then let it sit for the next 6 months. They check it, they tighten it, but that's how it grows. No water, no arable lands, no pesticides, no inputs. And then
at what depth? Like, are people like hitting these, or like, is there a way that they could get damaged?
There definitely is ways. We mark them really, really, really well. So, and also if you're boating in January in Maine and you're not paying attention to where you're going, If you miss the buoys, then you're doing something very, very wrong, and you shouldn't be out there in negative 10-degree weather. But
Jeez.
it's nasty. So we have everything really well marked. It's about 7 feet under the water, so there's very little visual impact at all, other than mooring balls. And then it grows at around. We usually have those set around 30 to 50 feet for the mooring. So it grows 10, 12 feet long by the end of the year. And we just started harvest season now. It's April 20th. So
super exciting.
Wow.
There's a few things I need to expand on here.
It's fascinating.
This is
fascinating.
Aquaculture is so cool.
Yeah.
And I read Eat Like a Fish by Brent Smith a while back, and that was like my indoctrination into aquaculture, and it was like absolutely mind-blowing. The coolest book I've ever read. But even prior to us talking about that, what I really liked about something you said about how the power of change is within the people, and like your statements that were just so empowering about how individuals have the ability to make a huge impact. And I think that's really important to call out for, why we're doing the Regen Brand podcast is because we want to educate individuals that they can make purchasing decisions that can have a huge positive impact. And that power really does come down to the individual. So just wanted to highlight that, really like aligned with a lot of what we talk about and the other folks we bring on this podcast. So that was super cool. Number two, we sort of skipped some of we briefly covered, I think you mentioned the power of bivalves and regenerative aquaculture. Kind of like give us some stats. Talk about, how did you first learn that these were regenerative? What was appealing to it or about it to you? How did you convey that message to the fishermen? Walk us through that process.
And like what about the agronomics of actually producing these like makes them regenerative and like is so good? Because I think that's the money piece, right?
Yeah, it is. I think I always get this sort of superior attitude when I'm on on a panel with like someone who's like, I do regenerative beef. I'm like, okay, regenerative beef. Like sure, it's better than non-regenerative meat, but like let's talk about actual regeneration. And I think seaweed is, people know generally that seaweed is good for the environment. I think in some ways it is oversold. I think you hear a lot about carbon sequestration, for example. For you guys know this, but maybe some of your listeners might not, that sequestration means permanently stored away.
Right.
When you eat something, your body is not a carbon sink. We can't just continue to add carbon to our body and it just gets loaded up there until the day we die. And then, if we ate a ton of seaweed salad, when we were 88, maybe that works. But like throughout your lifetime. But what is really impressive about seaweed is more, it's actually kind of more interesting than carbon sequestration. And I think right now we're all just looking for that silver bullet. So that sequestration piece is what everybody wants to talk about because it feels like, oh, here's an answer. We're going to solve climate change, sequestration. And people kind of go to that when the reality is the solution is regenerative cattle. It's regenerative vegetables. It's all of it.
Cycling. It's cycling, not sequestration.
It's all of it. It's all of it. And it's being better.
To your point, everybody's got that carbon tunnel vision. And I was actually really encouraged by a lot of the conversations at Climate Day for Expo West. It felt to me like the industry was kind of taking a step away from that carbon tunnel vision. And people are starting to talk about these cycles, which is really, really important and really needs to happen.
It's exactly. I mean, I think it's as if we're looking at our kids in school and saying they have to read Tolstoy in order to be good students. And the kids are like, I don't know how to do math. I don't know how to do math. I don't know how to be a person. I don't know, we just like are
But you can read Tolstoy and that's all you need.
You can read Tolstoy. Like, we're just like missing the whole puzzle. Like we're missing the development, like that's one indicator of a lot of different things that we need to do. And what Kelp does is, it's regenerative in more ways than just environmentally. But on the environmental side, it's regenerative in that it actually removes carbon nitrogen from the water column. So where it grows, we've done several different studies with different organizations that have shown by drawing carbon and nitrogen out of the water, it is actually reducing the pH of the water. So for those who aren't sort of like super into the conversation around ocean acidification, basically, as you all know, we have a lot of excess carbon in the air. What most people don't know is when that carbon hits the ocean, which is more than 70% of our of our world,
Mm-hmm.
that ocean absorbs that carbon and it changes the pH. It makes it more acidic. That
Mm.
acidity works a whole lot like how you would put Pepsi on metal. You,
Mm.
you see that acidic, when you put acidic things on, basic things, they erode. So just
Mm-hmm.
assume Coca-Cola sitting on your hubcap for uh, an hour, you're going to see some
Mm.
degradation. For 3 weeks, you're going to see some rust. Then you're going to see a
Mm.
hole eaten through. It's the same thing with shell-bearing organisms in the ocean. As that ocean becomes more acidic, shell-bearing organisms like bivalves, like more importantly phytoplankton, which is producing most
Mm.
of the oxygen in the air. We think it's trees. It's not. It's phytoplankton. They're seeing that erosion and that it makes it harder for them to survive because they're putting all of their energy into making sure that they're rebuilding their shells rather than
Mm.
their muscle strength, rather than their sort of like meat, or in the case of phytoplankton, just fighting to survive.
Wow.
So when you plant kelp in the water, what you're doing is you're drawing that carbon and nitrogen out of the water within that halo. So I want to make sure I'm not overselling it. It is within the halo of the kelp farm. We have done
Mm-hmm.
trials where we've done mussels within the kelp halo on the outside and then far away. That the ocean is very, 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 very big.
Mm-hmm.
So, like the water moves. So
Mm-hmm.
planting mussels, a quarter mile away, we don't see effects. But within that
Mm,
halo, you're seeing massive effects. In fact, you're seeing shell strength almost double as strong in only 6 months. You're seeing
wow.
muscle mass increase significantly. And that's both a combination of the fact that the muscles are able to put their energy into their meat rather than their shell, rebuilding their shell,
Mm.
but also
Hmm.
because they're feeding from the detritus of the kelp that is kind of feeding marine organisms there. We're also seeing ecosystem services in general. And then more importantly, maybe not more importantly, but equally as importantly, when it's being served on your plate,
Mm.
it is anything it is replaced, it is better than any single thing you could eat, which is
Ooh,
Wow.
spicy take
wild
there.
for the environment. Like
Okay.
no water, no
Mm.
arable land,
Mm.
making the ocean better.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like no downside to it. So
Mm-hmm.
even
Mm-hmm.
it,
Right.
it and so when you're replacing broccoli, people are like replacing meat. I'm like, cool, replacing meat, sure. Also
Yeah.
replacing spinach, which
Yeah.
uses
Mm,
water, pesticides, arable
Mm-hmm.
land. It's better than any other thing. I have this fight with my farmer colleagues and my oyster farmer colleagues because they would argue that they are equal to seaweed. I say they're a little
Yeah.
less good, but
Yeah.
I think the three of those combined, aquacultured bivalves and aquacultured seaweed are the best
hmm.
foods on the planet that you can eat for the planet. And then you add to that the adaptive side for fishermen being able to diversify their income in the face of climate change, and then you have a
Mm-hmm.
truly regenerative food.
That,
That's
yeah,
extraordinary. AC, you go
it, it
first.
it makes me think about like right the American prairie grasslands. We would have that same system with bison and other species, right? Which would be like the what is the actual natural uh, inputs and outputs of the system, which I think on land it's much harder to replicate or kind of I don't want to use the word industrialize, but like mechanize or produce lots of food with. Whereas it seems like this system we can replicate that natural biodiversity and those relationships and actually like do it in a more high production way, which I think is awesome because we need
The,
to produce a bunch of food.
yeah, I mean, the more kelp there is, the better it is for the environment. And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of incongruent with most things that we grow.
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah.
I mean, there is certainly an environmental carrying capacity. We see it in China.
Mm, mm,
Mm,
With Korea, however, they produce 33 million tons of seaweed,
wow.
mm,
Ton of
and
seaweed.
they could produce so much more, and the environment would continue to improve.
yeah.
It's incredible.
China has, you know, they have reached that environmental carrying capacity. But I can tell you, in the United States, there is no world in which we could plant even a quarter as much as China, just from a
Mm,
social perspective. So
mm,
we will never get to that environmental carrying capacity. And in the meantime, to get there, which is, they produce billions billions
mm,
of pounds. But
mm,
just getting there, every sort of Korea's water where the kelp farms are and I just got back from there on a trip with the World Wildlife Fund because conservation groups are sponsoring growth of as much kelp as possible because they recognize how good it is for the environment. They
Awesome.
wanted us to fly out to Korea, which World Wildlife Fund got us out there to say, like, this is the scale where it's still even more than this would be better for Korea.
Wow.
But you can go on a boat for 40 minutes and still not see the end of farms.
Crazy.
And it's and the water is regenerating with it every time. So I think kelp is one of those exceptions. Same with oysters and mussels, where you could really we could as consumers should not only be eating it because it's good for us. Kelp and mussels and oysters are super nutrient dense, but also the more we eat and the more we demand, the more can be grown and the better it is for the environment and for coastal communities.
Totally. And I want to touch base on the ocean acidification piece, and I really appreciate you educating us there. And this is a theory that's popped up in my brain. I'm hoping you can confirm or tell me I'm completely off the mark. From a land inputs perspective, two of the worst things that happen with phosphorus and nitrogen is the runoff that ends up in the ocean, causing carbon dead zones and contributing to ocean acidification. And based on what you just said, it feels like if we could start kelp farming in some of these major runoff areas like the Gulf of Mexico, could that help to sort of mitigate some of that crisis there because it's utilizing the nitrogen to grow the kelp instead?
There's a lot of people looking into kelp as a phytoremediation tool. It's not what we're doing. We're working on food sources. You don't want to have food from, think about the $1 billion or billion oyster project or million oyster project, or I forget the exact name of it.
In New York.
Yeah, and I can't vouch for that project one way or another. I don't know a lot about it, but think about that concept of putting a bunch of oysters in. You're not going to eat them, right?
Right. Yeah, it helps to clean up the environment. And just to explain that to the listeners, essentially people are putting bivalves, oysters, mussels, etc., into contaminated harbors and bodies of water to help to clean it up. And what Bri's saying is like people don't want to consume that because these oysters are consuming all of that pollution essentially, but they can still do a really great environmental service by cleaning up that body of water.
That's exactly right. Now kelp does not absorb as much, it doesn't absorb as much of the environment as bivalves, for example. So oysters are kind of bringing up a lot more intake. What kelp can do is feed off nitrogen. And to your point about kind of fertilizer outflow, it's the nitrogen that it can take up. Both the good thing and the bad thing about kelp is it's not, taking up a bunch of crap from the water, which makes it really good to eat. But we farm it in super clean cold waters anyway. But it can uptake nitrogen. So there is some work going on in New York, for example, right now. Not New York City, but kind of along the coast near like Montauk and places like that, where people are looking at phytoremediation. I think we're probably 2 or 3 years out from really understanding what kelp can do for that purpose. It's not our business model, but I think it's exciting to potentially see some of that happening.
Super cool.
Yeah. Bri, I want to make sure we talk about the commercial side of this, right? This has been an amazing kind of education on the backside, economic development, the agronomics, but let's talk about, you kind of went into this with the vertical integration and we kind of stopped at the agronomy, right? And I'm assuming building a brand was part of that vertical integration to have this whole system to commercialize these products and, basically build that economic engine. I'd love to have you educate us on kind of, what is commercializing this looks like? Why is that a challenge? I'm guessing based on kind of societal diets and like people just being uneducated about these foods. What does your channel mix look like? Just talk to us about like actually building this brand and what that's been like.
That's a cakewalk.
Easiest part of the job.
Easiest part of the job. People just, when they sit down for dinner, think, I want kelp. There's a lot of education that needs to be done. I mean, it's new to the United States, and it's not new to every population in the United States. Obviously, there's a lot of particularly Asian American communities that have really relied on seaweed for a really long time to be part of their diet.
How are they eating it? Like when you say China produces so much, like how do they eat it? Like I'm just so curious.
Everything.
Really?
It's a little bit in soup, a little bit in seasoning. It's a little bit. I mean, get an onigiri, get a tempura, get a rice
Okay.
bowl, get a kimchi. Like it's in everything, you know,
Wow.
just
That's
a little
cool.
bit of umami. And the reason is because I'm gonna bust on American diets for a second here, but like until about 10 years ago, if you said umami, people would be like, what's that? We had
Mhm.
of the different tastes, umami, like the depth of our food was so weak. It was
Yeah.
so like just put salt on it. Salt is not umami. And now like
Mm.
Japanese food is taking off, Korean food is taking off, Chinese food is, you know, coming to America in a more Chinese form rather than kind of the really delicious, beautiful cultural mix that is Chinese American
Yeah.
food, but different. You know, it's different
Right.
than a lot of the food that's coming now.
As somebody who spent 4 years working at PF Chang's, I can I'm very familiar with the Americanized Chinese food
And
that you're
it's
talking
great,
about.
right? Like it's, you know, I'm one of those people that I get really kind of up in I'm Italian American and I get up in arms when people say things like, "Oh, that's not
Shout out
real
to the
Chinese
Italians.
food." Yeah, shout to
Yeah.
it. That's not real American food. That's not real Italian, or that's not really Italian food. It's not real
Yeah.
Chinese food, or that's not real Mexican food. You're like, yeah, exactly, because that's what we do in the U.S. We are like,
Right.
Mhm.
bring it all. We'll make it American in some way or another.
Mm.
And American doesn't look like hot dogs and hamburgers. American looks like
Mm.
crazy ass ramen formulations, crazy ass burritos,
Mm.
some with rice in them. Why? I don't know, because we thought it would be great.
More
Let's deep
carbs.
fry it. Let's do it. Like, I mean, and that's so cool to have a culture. Like,
Mm.
that's what makes America beautiful, right? Like, you know,
Mm.
you go into the European Union and where I worked in my last tour, and you go to each country and you're like, cool, same dish in every
Mm.
restaurant in Germany, unless it's an
Mm.
American restaurant or a,
Yeah.
you know, like, but everybody, like, there's nothing new. What we do in America is we take all these different, the best of everything, and then we smash it together. And what people have realized in the last, you know, 10 years or so is that umami is a really important component that
Mm.
3/4 of the world have known forever is one of the most important components.
Mm.
We're just coming onto that train. So, you know, I think you're starting to see that influx of umami, and that's really, you can get umami from three things: fish, mushrooms, and seaweed. It's kind of it.
Mm. Mm.
And you know, anchovies are delicious, not super sustainable, and not everyone
Doesn't
likes fish.
doesn't all fermentation also add umami, or am I wrong there, Bri?
Yeah, most of it does. Yeah, for
Okay.
fermented foods, it kind of
Okay.
has that like probiotic, these kind of yeast strains that are like
Mhm.
miso or kind of like fermented beans, as
Got it.
usually it's the starters. That is always going to have like an umami flavor because it's got that kind
Mhm.
of sense. Um, you know, so but in the, you know, in the 90s in Pennsylvania, if someone said, let's go get some sushi, I'd be like, ew.
Yeah.
Now you can go to any restaurant, any grocery store in America, even if you're
Mm.
in, you know, far northern Maine, where there's a town that doesn't have a name, like R156, and there's sushi takeout and there's seaweed snacks, right? So, like,
Mm.
in the past 30 years, we have seen an explosion of seaweed onto the market. So people are eating it and people are seeing the
Mhm.
value of that taste profile, but the imports from Asia are not creative for the American palate. It's, you know, people
Mm.
aren't, you know, people in the US aren't used to taking a beautiful dried hand cut piece of
Right.
seaweed and putting it in a soup that they cook for 8 hours in a day. Like, it's not gonna
Right.
happen. That's not what we do here.
Mhm.
There's some that do, but not much. People want convenience. And
Mhm.
so to see that innovation, you know, we look at that as an opportunity of 15 aisles at the grocery store. Right
Mm.
now, seaweed is in a quarter of one. That means I have 14 and a half or 15 and a half, depending on what grocery store you're looking at, aisles
Mm.
to tackle. And
Love that.
I can put it in paneer, I can put it in kelp cubes, I can put it in chocolate, I can put it in crackers. I like, where do you
Mm.
want umami? Let's put kelp in it. And let's put
Right.
Mm.
domestic kelp in it. And so it is both the opportunity and the challenge, because it's also putting seaweed out there in categories that people don't know where they are. People don't know how to find them, and you have to do a lot, of things like this podcast, for example. Your listeners will now hear this podcast and be like, I didn't even know that I could get kelp in my smoothies. I'm gonna go out and try that. Or a sea veggie burger. They're brand new to the market. There's nothing like this out there. And so it is both the opportunity and the challenge. And we've been slowly sort of introducing first products on the outer end of grocery where like people who eat fermented foods are going to be like, sweet, yeah, seaweed, let's do it. Same with people who eat smoothies. Like they've been putting wheatgrass, which tastes like garbage, in their smoothies for a while. Kelp is good
and could be inflammatory.
And could be inflammatory. Yes, no, it's totally true.
Often contains mold spores because it's grown indoor in an unnatural environment.
Is that right?
That's correct. Most of the wheatgrass is grown indoor and is moldy, which is why some people feel like this nausea after taking a wheatgrass shot for the first few minutes. There's one company in Canada that does outdoor grown wheatgrass, and they do it frozen. But yeah, we're way off topic now.
No, I'm like fascinated by that. That's really good to know.
Grass is for cows. Grass is for cows, not humans. Okay?
No, it's totally true. Well, and people are eating it in their smoothies, right? So kelp is like a much easier inclusion and better for you and much more, adaptable. So we kind of stayed in those categories. Now we're moving toward the center of store and, trying to get more conventional customers because we've built sort of our ground base of ambassadors of people who are super excited about what we're doing and how we're doing it. Now we'd love to bring that to, the average 8-year-old who wants seaweed snacks in their lunch, which they're already having, but their parents don't know where it's from. They don't know what's in it. They don't know what water it's grown in. And they don't know what labor practices were used to grow it. And here we can provide something that's domestic. So I'm doing a video a few months from now or next month for just a passion project I have with this brand that does education for kids on eating different foods. It's called Kalamata's Kitchen. It's a beautiful
super cool.
Yeah, they do like several children's books and you read them about how to kind of try new foods. And anyway, we're doing a video on kelp and next month just to kind of talk about kids eating kelp. So I asked my kids last night, like, hey, you want to start a video? You want to like talk about kelp? And they're like, sure, whatever. It's a 7 and 5-year-old is what I have. And they were like, I was like, do you know some kids don't eat kelp? They're like, why? I'm like, I don't know. They think it's gross. And they're like, well, I think they're gross. Like, they don't get it. Like, why would they think that was gross? And I think like
classic 7-year-old response.
Yeah, I think they're gross, right? But like, the point being that like, it's all about just kids trying it, people trying it. Once it's in people's diets, we focus a lot on universities, then they become buyers through their whole lives.
There's a real I love media and content and branding and advertising and marketing and the whole thing. So I'm biased here, but like there's such a need for just like an all-out guerrilla style campaign for different regenerative foods like this. So like in my mind, I see a Netflix series where we go behind all this story that you've told us today. We talk about how you eat it. We talk about how it's grown. Like I see stuff like that. And I think back to like when I was a little kid at school, there's a giant poster of LeBron with a milk mustache, got milk. And it's like, well, I guess milk is cool. It's like, so like how do we recreate that for these products that are grown regeneratively? And like, it's funny, but like, it's very serious because there's a massive like marketing machine behind a lot of the stuff that we need to replace and we need to take market share from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you guys are doing that with this podcast though, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, no, it's true. Like these like the way that people are getting and we need to reach people in a number of different directions. We need to reach people from regeneration. We need to reach people from ocean health. We need to reach people from their care nutrient density, taste. People who want to see farmers and fishermen continue to have jobs. You have to hit people from all these different angles and one of them is going to appeal. And if it doesn't appeal to them, then I'm not going to spend any time on them anyway, right? Like, great, let's move on. And in fact, demographically, what we see is mid-millennials and younger, both genders, 100% behind seaweed. Millennial women up to Xers, women, sure. Men, Gen Xers and over, generally aren't our demographic.
Not pro seaweed.
Well,
Not,
these two masculine men that have been told they're too masculine on this podcast are firm seaweed kelp believers
there
now.
you
We're going to
go. Well,
spread the word.
I mean, millennials
100%.
and younger are. And that's also because men are making buying decisions in their 20s and
Mm,
30s and early 40s now.
mm,
Because believe it or not, us young millennials or mid millennials are actually in our 40s now. But we all like to think of ourselves as younger. But I think that that's something that I find really interesting as well is like when you think about marketing, who are you actually marketing to? And do you go for the
Mm.
people who it
mm,
takes a lot of the lift? No, you go for the people who are looking for the future of their planet, for their own health, but also men at that age are not making the buying decisions in the household. The people in the millennials and younger are, and they're interested in creating a better planet. And that's how we're bringing people to the brand for the first time. And then once they
mm.
try it, it has to be really, really good. People will
Right.
buy first for their sustainability goals. They'll buy second for the taste, and that's where our products really shine. Once we have first purchase, we see most people come back for a second.
Mm,
I wonder from like, so I'm putting my sales hat on, like category development, like we always compare when you're having these conversations with retailers, it's, what are category velocity expectations? How are you performing against the category? But because you're trying to break into various categories with this entirely
mhm,
new piece of innovation, like where do you compare yourself? Like who do you compare yourselves to? What are you trying to achieve within the category? Talk to us
mm,
about those interactions with the retailers.
Retailers, I have to say, like you know, to be kind of brand loyal, but true. I'm not doing this to try to get sales, but Whole Foods Market and Sprouts Farmers Market have both been massive champions of our work.
love
Heck
that.
yeah.
And to see, just on June 20th, I'm going down to Austin as the invited grocery vendor, one out of the entire, all of them, to talk about our mission to the
Wow.
entire senior team because they're like, this is the type of brand that is actually walking the walk.
Yeah.
And
Mm,
similarly with Sprouts, I mean, you guys saw at Expo West, you might have seen like our key buyer from Sprouts just came back and flipped burgers with us for a while. I mean, people
Oh,
are
that's
so
dedicated
awesome.
to
cool.
what we're doing and
Mm,
they want us to succeed. That doesn't always transfer into people taking it on the shelf. And I think
mm,
um, people are always like, great, I want this to be the case. Let me help you. And let me help you target our market. And I think a perfect example is like, hey, your kelp cubes are really, really beautiful. We want them. We know they will sell, but they will not sell unless you tell us on the front cover how I'm supposed to use it. I'm like, great, help us with
mm,
Mm,
our boxes then, right? Like,
right,
we're
mhm,
learning
right.
too. You're the expert on selling to your customers. We're the expert on making kelp. So tell us. So
mhm,
it's also, I think, going into this with really dropping any hubris. I see so many people in the CPG sector, so many founders and entrepreneurs who the swagger of just like, I know best. I am,
mm,
the person who is going to sell, something vapid like a popcorn with a
mhm.
semi-regenerative sprinkle on it or some shit. But like there's like they
That
like,
umami sprinkle on
no,
top.
I have a little bit of sprinkle. It's we're doing things better with our regenerative popcorn. You're like, okay, cool. But like no offense to popcorn, but I think we're doing something that's so different and so new that if we
Mm,
don't have our minds open to learning from as many people as we can and
mm,
getting the people who are helping us on board as supporters of what we're doing, the
mm,
vast majority of our placements in retail or in ingredient, people wanting to use our product is because they are inspired by what we're doing. And I think like perfect
mm,
example, Lollyware, they're coming out with a seaweed straw. Our product is more expensive than Wild Harvest by a
mm,
lot. And
mm,
they have a price point they have to reach because they're a straw.
mm,
But they're working with us to figure out how do we make this work? How do we get, and we'll be announcing a big partnership next month with them. But because it's the right thing and because they're excited about working with a woman run company who's investing in the future of Maine. And
mm.
I think that's really been fun for us is just dropping the hubris and being like, teach us, where
Yeah.
do we want kelp? Because we're not a sea veggie burger company. We're not a kelp cube company. We're not a
Hmm.
fermented
Mm,
seaweed salad company. We're a kelp company. And what can we do to get as much kelp as possible out to consumers so that we can get more farmers in the water, because the situation is urgent. We need to act now, and we need to get more farms in the water with more fishermen with diversified incomes, and we need to do it now. So the more people who buy whatever it is that we make, the more we can have an impact.
And I would almost add, you're not a kelp company, you're a main economic development company, which is like what all these businesses need to be. And which is why I think Kyle and I are so passionate about talking about brands, because brands are either parts of, or they're not either, they're always parts of the ecosystem that is doing that economic development piece. And I think, like more vertical integration, more partnerships, more diverse capital stacks, like we need all those things. So curious if you can just give us like a brief peek behind the curtain of like, how have you set up the different business entities, if there is multiple entities, and like how have you funded this whole thing?
Yeah, I think there's a big difference behind if a nonprofit has to do work in an area, it should be to set something up to disappear. So what I mean by that is, if there are market solutions for a problem, there's no need for nonprofits. And this is in the food and ag space. I can't speak for, social services is a completely different scenario, right? That's separate. But in the food and agriculture space or seafood, if there's a nonprofit that's not working to put themselves out of business, then they're not working toward the right solution. And I think for Atlantic Sea Farms, people say, "Are you a nonprofit?" And I'm like, "Absolutely, we're not profitable yet, but we have a path to profitability. If we are not profitable, this is not a viable economic solution. I need to be able to be hit by a bus in 5 years, and every funder needs to be able to hit by a bus, and this still needs to continue."
Right.
And I think, when you're looking at constant grant cycles as a nonprofit or as sort of like regenerative thinking, like that's great, but unless it can stand on its own 2 feet without the whims of philanthropy, then you're not proving anything. And if I'm going to build a network of 100 farmers growing 100,000 pounds in Maine in the next 4 years, they need to know that their product is going to be sold. And they need to know that their kids should invest in it. This is their investment. And they're leading this future. So I think that's why a brand is so important to us, and why profitability is. If we are insanely profitable because we did good and because we're doing well by doing good, then we've actually really proven that this is viable industry. Until we do that, we've proven nothing. So right now I'm not independently wealthy at all. And I always think it's funny when people are like, "Oh yeah, seed, friends and family money." I'm like, whose friends and family are you talking to? Why don't I have friends and family like that? Like, and that's certainly not the world I came from. And in fact, someday when I'm older and we've made this a huge success, my goal would be to start an entire fund called Friends and Family to act as that for the entrepreneurs that, because it's a ridiculous concept that friends and family fund people, because what we're doing is we're saying 99% of people will never have the opportunity because they're not from the social networks that allow them to do that. But similarly, women only receive 2% of the venture funding in the country right now, even though they run 50% of the businesses. That's a staggering statistic. And if we're not talking about venture funding, I'm not really sure what we're talking about, but that statistic it speaks for itself. 2%. I remember someone said, "Yeah, but Bri, when you add a male co-founder to it, it's 9%.
Oof, not the right response.
No.
Yeah, okay. That's even worse. So 2% is a pretty bleak number. And when you look at regenerative agriculture, the funding is pretty bleak for most of those brands. So we have really run against the tide in pretty much every way on those statistics, which makes me really proud of what we're doing, but also hopefully can blaze the path for others that can step behind us. And it's not because I'm from money, you know, and it's simply through, you know, a lot of luck, quite frankly, but also a firm business idea that people really could get behind and get excited about. But we are mostly venture backed right now. Um, and those are all venture funds that are based in sort of the nexus of impact and profit. So we don't take pure impact money, and we certainly wouldn't bring on someone that's like pure hedge fund. We need the big sort of hockey stick growth right now kind of funder, but somewhere in between, because we need to be held accountable to growth and profitability in order to be able to serve the people that we're trying to serve, which is the fishermen that we're working with.
Yeah.
I want to push back on one thing. You mentioned luck,
Yeah.
and to me, luck is where hard work meets opportunity.
Yep.
So whatever
100%.
luck you ran into, I think that there's probably a bit more credit than you gave yourself on this, at least in that statement.
No, it's been a lot of grit too. But I mean, it's always luck too, right? Like that's always part of life, right?
Yeah.
You grit, you work hard, you have a fundamental business idea that makes sense, you do really, really good work. You know, and in some areas we've had nothing but bad luck. Like 2 weeks prior to COVID hitting, we launched a giant bowl with David Chang and Sweetgreen. There is billboards in the middle of Times Square that said buy kelp at Sweetgreen with David Chang holding up a big thing of kelp. And we had no retail presence. And we were like, we've done it. We're going to sell out of kelp. Like, let's get more farmers in the water. And then 3 weeks later, there was a picture of Times Square being empty with that stupid billboard right in the background that was kind of like screaming at us. But, you know, and you get back up, you know, but I still consider myself just so fortunate to, number one, have been able to live on this coast and see this tremendous opportunity. There's a lot of luck that comes from building up strong relationships with fishermen and having them trust me and then being like, yeah, sure, I'll do this. Because it takes the first 3 to prove it out so that other people get in. And without those first 3, we would be nowhere. And then the radios start going off like, hey guys, they actually pick up that kelp. Where do you think they're going with it? What are they doing with kelp? Like, you know, and then kind of going from there. So it's a combination of a lot of things, but you know, we will likely be raising one more pretty significant round, really bringing on investors, continuing to bring on investors that believe in what we're doing and really putting the people of the business at the core of what we're doing and the consumers on the other end of the planet. And then hopefully we'll be, you know, in a place where we can look out and assess like, okay, do we become sort of the brand that, you know, starts building farms in other places and really like taking this model and replicating it elsewhere, or, you know, what do we do? So we are actually starting to work in Alaska next year. We have a farm in Rhode Island this year that we work with. And so we are starting to kind of move off geographically because there's a lot of opportunity elsewhere to also kind of replicate this model.
That's incredible. I want to take us to the future. What the future holds for Atlantic Sea Farms, and there's also 2 questions I have failed to ask so far. So if you can somehow tie both of these into your answer, that'd be great. Number one, I'd like to learn more about the nutritional density piece of sea vegetables in general, and then number 2, like all the potential utilizations of seaweed, kelp, sea vegetables, and like that, whether that be animal feed, plastics, etc. So I've given you quite a task to try to, you know, answer the future of the brand while incorporating those 2 things. But just put it out there, you know, what's the future hold for Atlantic Sea Farms?
So right now we're growing 2 species of seaweeds, skinny kelp and sugar kelp. Skinny kelp is only found in Maine.
How many species are there?
So there are currently about 195 macroalgae species in Maine. There's
in Maine.
In the Gulf of Maine. There's another 100 plus in Alaska. I was in New Zealand earlier this year. They have over 1,000 native species of macroalgae.
Oh my goodness.
About 400 of them that don't exist anywhere but New Zealand.
That's cool.
So the opportunities are, and when I say this, I mean it honestly, the opportunities are boundless. And I don't think we've even scratched the surface.
I mean, it almost feels disrespectful to just call it all kelp or
Yeah.
seaweed. It'd be like if we didn't have names like corn and sweet potato, if we just called everything vegetables.
You know, it's
Like if there's that level of diversity, it seems borderline disrespectful to the plant.
it kind of is. There's our seaweed scientist who, if you're a seaweed scientist, you're called a phycologist for just a fun piece of trivia
Okay.
Love
for
that.
parties. Our phycologist on staff, who's just absolutely brilliant. We were at a board meeting last month, and I said to him beforehand, like, hey, just let's make sure that we're going to be presenting on a lot of the science. I think, something that'll be really helpful is if you boil it down to make sure that it's really kind of accessible so everyone can use the language that you're using. He said, great. And I had never heard him say this before, and I lost it in the middle of the meeting. I couldn't keep a straight face. He said, so one of the new species we're working to grow is a red seaweed, and it's got 40% protein content. It's amazing. It's never been grown at scale in the ocean. We have a number of years before we're going to be able to commercialize it, if we can at all, but we're working on it. And it is native to the Gulf of Maine. It's not like we're introducing anything, but we would be taking pressure off the wild beds because it's a highly commercial species. And it's called dulse. And he said, just for clarity, we are closer related genetically to mushrooms than dulse is to kelp.
What?
Wow.
And dulse is a type of kelp.
No, dulse is a red seaweed. So kelp is a species of brown seaweed.
Wow.
But when he said that,
smokes.
it really got. I was like, I guess that's what I meant by dialing it down to the. But I can't kind of get that out of my head.
Wow.
But it's the morphology, the genetic makeup, all of it is so different. So I think in Asia, in East Asia, people have been growing seaweeds for about 400 years. They've been growing it commercially, like industrially sized, and since the 70s. And there's still only between 5 and 10 species grown at scale. And
Wow.
we are so and they use it mostly for food or food extracts. So there are certain types of seaweed in Indonesia, for example, like when they're in your toothpaste, your shampoo, they're in sort of everything you use, but it's either a food or sort of a emulsifier. What we can do with seaweed is not even remotely started. And I talk about bioplastics. That's kind of a first step that we're working on. But there's also, things called fucoidins, a key nutrient in many kelps called fucoidins, which are being more and more studied now that people think might actually be, key to unlocking some of the issues around Alzheimer's.
Wow.
Whoa.
There's types of, and there's a lot more research to be done. I'm not going to
So
say
potential pharmaceutical applications.
Huge potential pharmaceutical applications. And again, we're probably 3 to 10 years away from really knowing those, but some really exciting work coming out of some of the US and Europe in particular around the fucoidin studies. Iodine is another one. We used to all eat iodized salt. We don't anymore. And people aren't, the reason that iodine was added to salt in the 40s and 50s is because people weren't eating enough iodine. We're still not eating enough iodine, as that has been sort of phased out. And kelp has a ton of iodine in it, which is great for thyroid function. Without iodine, our thyroids don't function. And there's some assessments that around 30% of the American population has thyroid dysfunction.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, like, you kind of add these things, plus then it's just delicious. If you look at kind of meat alternatives, protein content in many seaweeds that we're not commercially growing are extremely high, and they improve the environment. So, when I look at the future of Atlantic Sea Farms, it's not kelp. It's, lots of different seaweeds. It's a custom grower. It's being able to say, hey, you want more polyphenols for your bioplastics? I've been able to cultivate this species of shotgun kelp that is 60% polyphenols, and we'll process that into bioplastics to help eliminate the plastic bag problem. There's so many ways to go with this, and at the base of it, if Atlantic Sea Farms is doing it, it's being led by fishermen, and I can't kind of go to that enough. We are creating a system where we can lead the way
Mm-hmm.
for fishermen to diversify so that in 30, 40, 50 years, we look at the coast of Maine, we look at the coast of Alaska, we look at the coast of New Zealand, and we see seaweed being the answer for health issues, for environmental issues, for food issues, for whatever. And see thriving working waterfronts that are maybe even more working waterfront infrastructure than we have now instead of yachts.
It's crazy. It sounds like a circular powerhouse of opportunities. And I'm
Also, shout
excited
out
to
to
see it come to
somehow
life.
managing to answer the future outlook question while
Yeah.
incorporating both sub questions in there. So great work.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I talk
Bri,
about seaweed a lot.
yeah. Yeah. Bri, last question to take us home was the question we kind of asked all of our guests, which is, how can Regen Brands get to 50% market share by 2050? What needs to happen?
Whew. I think there's a few things that need to happen. I think one, people need to feel, consumers need to feel and understand, not just understand, but really feel in their hearts that they can make decisions at the grocery store that will help improve the planet. And that's going to take green and blue washing, because in my industry it's called blue washing, to be really called out and evaporated. Because when people feel like they're making good decisions and then find out that they're not, that's even more terrifying to me. That loss of hope is even more terrifying than people who haven't started the process.
Yeah.
So it's going to take regenerative brands to be honest about who they are and what they're doing and how they're doing it. I also think it's going to take buyers' decisions to set goals and really work to put those into place. And I think those goals need to be placed around people and planet, not just technology solutions. And I think right now, sometimes the fastest way for a brand like, I mean, a grocery chain like Kroger or Walmart or whatever to reach their goals is to put all goals in a place that are achieved through carbon offsets, that are achieved through technology rather than through meaningful sourcing. And I think people being able to hold these places accountable are going to help brands like Atlantic Sea Farms be able to plug in. I think the other thing that's going to need to happen in a really big way is for packaging companies to catch up with consumer demand, because right now I think that is a huge problem for regenerative brands like Atlantic Sea Farms, is there's not a lot of packaging, particularly in the frozen and refrigerated space, that is regenerative in and of itself and functional. And then it's going to take dollars from all of the people who want to make the planet better, instead of putting them into climate nonprofits or solutions that make them feel better through philanthropy. It's going to be investing in future businesses that can actually change the game rather than run programming.
I think both Anthony and I are stoked because your answer incorporated my personal project, passion project, and Anthony's, and various others. But I think you hit the nail on the head, and you did a really good job of kind of breaking down each different sector that needs what type of support to make this thing work. I read an interesting article earlier this week, I think on Grocery Dive, about how regenerative investments are faltering because there's no level of standardization to prove the regenerative claims being made by the brands. And until that is standardized, the investment community just doesn't really have the mechanism to say, like, okay, I believe in this or I don't. So to your point about transparency and like making sure that like the regenerative claims are actually legit, totally agree that that needs to happen. At the same time, it's such a complex, complicated problem because measuring the impact of regenerative aquaculture versus grass-fed bison, completely different on so many levels. So it's a huge challenge that we're going to have to face as a movement, but something that needs to be done.
Well, and I think with that, getting kind of heady for a second is understanding the value of investments. I think so many times regenerative investors or people who claim to be regenerative investors still want to see the growth of what is liquid death? What is that? Bottled water company. And I don't know anything about them. I shouldn't point to like a specific brand, but like growth at all costs is what gives you the hockey stick.
Mm.
If you're
Right.
if you're an investor in regenerative brands, you have to recognize that it cannot be growth at all costs.
Mm.
And growth, yes. Substantial growth, absolutely. Market
Mm.
rate returns, sure.
Mm.
Growth at all costs, absolutely not. That has what has gotten us into the problem we're in environmentally.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think that there needs to be some value placed around environmental impact in the investing space. And I
Mhm.
think that's not in the form of carbon credits, but as
Mm.
far as, figuring out some sort of, people much smarter than me should be looking into figuring out, like, how do we financially incentivize those sort of investments beyond beyond carbon credits, because they mean
Mm.
nothing. um,
Mhm.
but like, how can we kind of reward that? Because I do think there's a lot of talk around regeneration,
Mm.
and it often is very incongruent with the growth expectations and the returns that people want to see. I mean, a 10x return on a 5-year investment in
Mm.
regenerative aquaculture means growth at all costs.
Yeah.
And you got to wonder when funds have that sort of um, expectation,
Mm.
if we're really talking about regeneration or if we're talking about greenwashing and making
Mm.
sort of social signaling decisions. I think a perfect example is 90% of residential solar panels installed in the United States are pointed toward the road, not necessarily because
Mm.
that's where the sun shines, but because
Mm.
people want to show, I'm not saying 90% of the time it's not where the sun shines, but a
Mm.
lot of time it's not. It's because people want to show their neighbors that they put up solar panels because it's social
Mhm.
signaling that they
Mhm.
are environmentally conscious.
Interesting.
And that's what you see with a lot of regen funds too. And I think
Mm.
we as a community need to be challenging that, as growth at all costs is not regenerative. But how
Mm.
can we show that, you know growth is really, really important, profitability is really, really important. 5x
Mhm.
returns, we should be able to show really good growth with that.
Mhm.
But maybe our expectations around how companies should grow is part of the problem and why our planet is broken.
Mm. God, Bri, you and I could have a whole separate 90-minute conversation about that. So many things I'd like to add there. You hit the nail on the head, and I think it comes down to a few things, right? It comes down to the venture model is not the right model for all these businesses, and a lot of times the venture money needs to be married with other forms of capital that make a stack that can satisfy all those things that you just talked about. So it's about
Yeah.
having really strong individual tools and then us capital stacking across the ecosystem, and that is really, we are massively undercapitalized as an ecosystem. So that's one problem. And then we need those individual entities created, and then we need them to work together. And I
Yeah.
think we can get there, but like that's the solve for those things that you
I
said, in
mean,
my opinion.
totally. And I will say we've now raised $9 million in total,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all from people like that. They are
Congrats.
out
Mm-hmm.
there. They're
Yeah,
amazing
congratulations.
people out there that really truly stand behind what they're saying. And
Mm-hmm.
um those people are few and far between, but man, when you get them, like, the
Mm-hmm.
support that we have for our business from our shareholder group is unbelievably cool.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's not that they're not high pressure. Of course they are. They want us to
Mm-hmm.
meet our goals.
Right.
But man, they are out there. I just wish there were a whole lot more.
Mm-hmm. We're working on it.
Yeah. Also, I just want to expand a little bit on the example you presented between Atlantic Sea Farms and Liquid Death. Liquid Death, from an innovation standpoint, they're putting water, which humans have been consuming for ever, literally,
Mm-hmm.
into an aluminum can, which has been produced since probably the 50s, maybe before that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the supply chain doesn't have to change for a brand like that to grow, but to get lobster fishermen to learn and understand about aquaculture, to teach them to solve all these problems, like that takes time. And there's just, to your point, where like, if we're really trying to change the food system, those expectations have to shift because the models are completely different, and there's no way that a regenerative brand who's truly doing things the right way can achieve those same types of growth numbers.
They can't. But you know what would be, I said Liquid Death, but let's talk about General Mills, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what would really blow Atlantic Sea Farms up? General Mills putting our kelp powder, in
Mm-hmm.
3 of their SKUs.
Mm-hmm.
These brands have the ability, we do ingredient, we're not just a brand. Our
Yeah.
brand is
Mhm.
a small component of our work. And to me, like, okay, Liquid Death, like, take that growth, put some kelp in it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's
Love it.
let's challenge you to, let's go, Unilever.
Mm.
Let's put kelp in a cracker, because you know what? It also sells. It's not a risk. I think, like I said, Whole Foods is doing some amazing work. They're in Kroger right now. They're doing a bunch of innovation work with their brand on our kelp. Like, cool, let's actually stand where we say we're going to. So I think people are trying. I do think, though, there's huge opportunity for those brands that have had that incredible growth to really assess their supply chain and be like, okay, cool, we've gotten here. And we did it at growth at all costs. Now that we're here, what can we do that actually changes the game?
Hashtag put some kelp in it.
Put some kelp in it. Kelp in
Put
everything.
some kelp in it.
Eat more kelp. Moral of the podcast.
Exactly.
Yeah. Bri, you're a legend.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is amazing.
Thank you, guys. It was so great to talk to you.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website. Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.